It's the first revision in 10 years. Japan's big shift in its defense posture followed seismic changes in the global geopolitical situation.
The Navy is now equipped with large helicopter carriers that are being converted into small yet powerful aircraft carriers capable of carrying F-35 stealth fighters. The military is now focusing on the early detection of incoming threats and its ability to stop them long before they reach Japanese shores. Long-range radar is being purchased and upgraded.
Japan has just taken the world by storm with its insane military buildup. We're talking about missile systems and long-range strike capabilities, fighter jets and aircraft carriers, naval power and submarines, space, cyber and electronic warfare, drones and unmanned systems. Now, this was a country known for its peaceful constitution and its strong promise never to go to war again since the end of World War II. But now, the same country is spending billions of dollars to build up one of the strongest military forces on the planet. In fact, Japan is on track to become the third largest military spender in the world by 2027. Only the United States and China will be spending more on defense than Japan. And yes, China is terrified because this new Japan has the firepower to take on China's military head-to-head and inflict devastating damage if it ever comes to that. But here's the twist. It's not just China that should be worried. The United States is not safe either. Japan is now standing up to Trump's aggressive demands and challenging America's grip on power in the Pacific. But how are Trump and China responding to this? Could Japan's new military strength become the one thing that ruins Trump's entire Indo-Pacific strategy? And why did Japan decide to go down this path in the first place? In December 2022, the Japanese Prime Minister at the time, Fumio Kishida, announced a massive jump in military spending. The plan was to raise defense spending by 60% over the next 5 years. That adds up to around 43 trillion yen, which was about 320 billion US dollars at the time. By late 2024, Japan approved its defense budget for 2025, and it was a record breaker. The defense budget for 2025 hit $55.13 billion, marking the 13th year in a row that Japan has increased its military spending.
Japan will also align its defense spending to be on par with NATO countries, aiming to raise its defense spending from 1% of its GDP to 2%.
Now the question is, what are they actually buying with this money, and why? You see, for many years, Japan's military was called the Self-Defense Forces, or SDF. The idea was simple. They could defend their country if anyone attacked them, but they were not allowed to strike first. Japan was not supposed to have weapons that could attack other countries. Their constitution, especially Article 9, made sure of that. But now, that rule is getting pushed aside. Japan is now acquiring long-range strike missiles and other advanced military technologies to strengthen its defense capabilities.
Japan is arming itself at an unprecedented rate. Concerns about North Korea's missile development and China's military expansion have driven the sharp increase in defense spending as Japan moves away from its post-World War II pacifist constitution and takes a more robust approach to defense.
In January 2001, they signed a $1.7 billion contract to acquire 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States. These are not defensive weapons. These are long-range missiles that can hit targets far outside of Japan's borders. The Tomahawk missiles are the same kind of weapons the US military has used in wars across the Middle East.
It's also buying long-range stealth missiles for its F-15 fighter jets and has begun mass production of advanced anti-ship missiles. Then there's the investment in hypersonic missile technology, combat drones, and joint projects with the UK and Italy on sixth-generation advanced fighter jet prototypes.
But Japan isn't buying only weapons. They are also building new military bases. One of the most important new bases is on Ishigaki Island, a small island sitting close to both Taiwan and China. This base is part of a larger plan to strengthen Japan's defenses across the Nansei Islands, which are a chain of islands stretching between Japan and Taiwan. The idea is to be ready if any conflict breaks out in the region. At the same time, Japan has been showing up at major military exercises around the world. In 2024 alone, Japan took part in some of the biggest international military drills, like RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific exercise, which is led by the United States and involves 29 countries. Japan also joined Keen Sword, which is a US-Japan military exercise, and Malabar, a naval exercise hosted by India. Another one they participated in is called Pacific Vanguard, Guard, which includes the US and other close allies. These exercises are not small events, they are practice runs for real war situations, and Japan is right there, side by side with the US and its allies. But there's one more twist to this story, and that is where President Trump comes in. You see, while Japan was overhauling its entire military infrastructure, Trump was also preparing for a possible war with China. But the problem is, it's no longer business as usual for Trump in the region, because now Japan is joining forces with other Indo-Pacific countries to stand up to his aggression. But we'll get to the details of all that later. For now, we have to understand why the world is so shocked by Japan's military buildup today. This will take us back to how Japan's pacifist identity began at the end of World War II. Back then, Japan wasn't seen as a peaceful nation. It was known as a brutal empire, one that had spent decades fighting, conquering, and expanding across Asia. By the early 1900s, Japan had already taken control of places like Taiwan in 1895 and Korea in 1910. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and by 1937, it launched a full-scale invasion of China. The worst of Japan's violence showed in what's known as the Nanjing Massacre, where Japanese soldiers slaughtered between 100,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians. This was one of the darkest war crimes of that time. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, which pulled the United States into World War II. Over the next few years, Japan pushed deep into the Pacific, but its ambition came at a heavy cost. The war left Japan devastated. More than 3 million Japanese soldiers and civilians were killed. The final blow came in August 1945, when the US dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, the other on Nagasaki. Around 200,000 people died in those attacks, many of them civilians. They had to die before Japan made the decision to surrender, because they were now left with no other choice. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation for the very first time by radio, announcing Japan's surrender. This was a moment of deep shame and heartbreak for the Japanese people. Their once mighty empire had collapsed. In the aftermath, the United States led the rebuilding of Japan, and General Douglas MacArthur, as the supreme commander of the Allied powers, oversaw this process. One of his biggest goals was to make sure Japan would never again become a military threat to the world. That's where Article 9 of Japan's new constitution came in. Signed into law in 1947, Article 9 was Japan's official promise to the world that it would never go to war again. The law clearly stated the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. It also said Japan would never maintain land, sea, or air forces or any other war potential. This section of the Constitution became part of Japan's national identity. Many Japanese people, especially after witnessing the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, fully embraced the idea of pacifism. But the world didn't stay peaceful for long. By 1950, just 5 years after Japan's surrender, the Korean War broke out. This conflict, right next door to Japan, pitted North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, against South Korea, supported by the US and other allies. The war created a problem for the United States. They needed support in the region, and Japan was perfectly positioned. But Japan couldn't help, because the country had already promised the world that it would never get involved in wars. However, the country also needed to defend itself in the case of any foreign aggression. So, in 1954, Japan created the Japan Self-Defense Forces, or SDF. These weren't officially called an army, but they were trained and armed like one. The idea was that Japan could defend itself if attacked, but could not attack anyone first. At the same time, the US-Japan Security Treaty was signed. This agreement gave the United States the right to station military forces across Japan. Over the years, the US built more than 130 military bases across Japanese territory. American troops became a permanent presence, and Japan became a key base for the US military in Asia. For many Japanese citizens, this arrangement seemed like a fair balance. Their own country wouldn't go to war, but the US would protect them. But as time went on, that system began to collapse. During the 1991 Gulf War, Japan's constitution prevented it from sending troops to help its allies. Instead, Japan sent $13 billion in financial aid to support the US-led coalition. But this move drew harsh criticism. Many countries mocked Japan and called what it did checkbook diplomacy. This global embarrassment pushed Japan's leaders to rethink the strict limits on their military. Just 1 year later, Japan passed a new law allowing the self-defense forces to take part in United Nations peacekeeping missions overseas. It was the first time since World War II that Japanese troops were allowed to operate outside their own country. The first mission was in Cambodia, where Japan sent 600 engineering troops, 75 civilian police officers, 8 unarmed military observers, 41 election observers. Soon after, Japan also sent personnel to Mozambique, East Timor, and other conflict zones. These were all still under the banner of peacekeeping, but now they were clearly involved in global military operations. Meanwhile, Japan quietly began upgrading its military technology. In the late 2000s, they built what they called anti-submarine helicopter carriers. But in reality, these ships looked and functioned much like small aircraft carriers, and you don't build those kinds of things for just self-defense. Anyway, one of the strongest political pushes toward military expansion came from Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who led Japan for several terms. In 2014, Abe's government approved a major reinterpretation of Article 9. This change allowed Japan to exercise what they called collective self-defense. This meant Japan could now fight alongside allies like the United States if those allies were attacked, even if Japan itself wasn't directly targeted. This change was a huge step away from Japan's pacifist roots, and many people in Japan protested fiercely against it. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets, saying that Abe was betraying Japan's pacifist identity, but Abe didn't back down. In 2015, Japan's parliament passed laws giving the self-defense forces the legal right to support other countries in combat situations. Abe's long-term goal was to completely rewrite Article 9 and remove the ban on military power altogether. But his resignation in 2020 stopped that plan. Even though the full rewrite never happened, the message is now very clear. Japan's pacifism is no longer as solid as it once was. Little by little, year by year, Japan has been rebuilding its military power. The Japanese government did it quietly at first, but now, as we're seeing today, more openly than ever before. But Japan didn't make these moves for no reason. There were powerful forces and dangerous threats that pushed the country down this path.
In particular, North Korea's unprecedented missile test in the last 1 year, China's growing military assertiveness, rising tensions across the Taiwan Strait, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These events have contributed to rising public support for Japan's bolstering of its defense capabilities, even though its pacifist constitution stipulates it will forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation.
While Japan was holding on to its pacifist identity, the neighborhood around it was growing more dangerous by the day. Right next door is China, the world's second largest military power, armed with nuclear weapons. To the north is North Korea, unpredictable, hostile, and also nuclear armed. And to the west, there's Russia, another nuclear power, with a long history of tension with Japan. Surrounded by these powerful, aggressive neighbors, Japan found itself caught in the middle of one of the most dangerous regions on the planet. One of the biggest flashpoints is the fight over a small group of uninhabited islands in the East China Sea. To Japan, they're the Senkaku Islands, while China calls them the Diaoyu Islands. Both countries have been claiming ownership for years. Chinese Coast Guard ships have been entering the waters around these islands, testing Japan's ability and willingness to defend its territory. The situation hit a new level of seriousness in 2022 when China held military drills near these disputed islands and fired 5 ballistic missiles that landed inside Japan's exclusive economic zone. This was the first time China had openly crossed that line.
But China's aggression has changed everything. Last August, it fired 5 missiles that landed in Japanese waters. And in December, China sailed its aircraft carrier between 2 of Japan's southern islands. As a result, there's broad support these days for a more muscular military.
But the Senkaku Islands aren't the only concern here. There's also the issue of Taiwan. Taiwan sits just about 60 miles away from Japan's westernmost island, Yonaguni. If any conflict breaks out between China and Taiwan, Japan would be right in the middle of it, whether they like it or not. Japan's leaders know this, and they know that if China ever tries to take Taiwan by force, it's almost guaranteed that Japan will be dragged into the fight, especially with the US-Japan military alliance in place. And then there's also North Korea. This is a country that has spent the last 2 decades building and testing nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. In 2017, North Korea launched a missile that flew directly over Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island. While the missile did not cause any damage, it triggered emergency alerts and sent millions of Japanese citizens running for cover. This was not the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Since 2006, North Korea has conducted at least 6 nuclear tests, and their leader, Kim Jong-un, has repeatedly threatened Japan. He has called it a pawn of the United States and warned that he could turn Japanese cities into ashes. These threats cut especially deep for Japan because it is the only country in the world that has ever experienced the horrors of nuclear weapons firsthand, and the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still fresh in the minds of many Japanese people. But despite Japan's deep history of standing against nuclear weapons, they also know they can't face these threats alone. Japan has long relied on what's called the US nuclear umbrella. This is the promise that if Japan is attacked, the United States would use its own nuclear weapons to defend the country. But with North Korea's missiles now capable of reaching almost any part of Japan, and with China building the world's largest navy, many Japanese leaders started asking themselves if the US guarantee to protect them is enough. The turning point for Japan came in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. On the surface, this conflict was happening 5,000 miles away from Japan, but the message it sent hit close to home.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has impacted so heavily into the Japanese society.
But is the worry that Russia would do the same to Japan, or that China would look and say, if they did it, we can?
That's exactly. We need to keep sending the strategic message to China.
Russia's attack on Ukraine showed the world that even in the 21st century, borders can be erased by force, treaties and promises can be broken, and being peaceful does not mean being safe. One Japanese politician, Hitoshi Nakama, put it bluntly, peace relies on a balance of power. Russia attacked Ukraine. It's a mistake to think that we won't be attacked just because we don't have an army. That era is over. This one statement captured the new mood rising inside Japan. Too, a majority of Japanese citizens began to support the idea of strengthening their country's military defenses. People who once proudly believed that Japan should never hold weapons were now demanding drastic defense upgrades. According to Toshimichi Nagaiwa, a retired general from Japan's Air Self-Defense Force, Japan was 200 meters behind in a 400-meter sprint when it came to modernizing its military. Years of underinvestment had left Japan short on munitions, spare parts, and critical supplies. While China was building warships at record speed, Japan was struggling just to meet its basic defense needs. It became painfully clear, if Japan wanted to survive in this dangerous neighborhood, something had to change. The growing threats from China, North Korea, and even Russia forced Japan to step away from its comfort zone as a pacifist nation. Now, as Japan was quietly moving away from its pacifist image, one person came in and put that shift on full speed. Donald Trump. This time, he's not playing nice in his strategy toward Asia. He's putting pressure, showing power, and preparing for war. Trump's administration has made it very clear that China is the biggest threat to American power.
President Trump declaring he will not roll back his staggering 145% tariffs on all Chinese products entering the U.S. unless China agrees to substantial concessions.
Well, I'm not going to drop them unless they give us something that's, substantial. Otherwise, I'm not going to drop them.
But it's not clear what concessions would be enough, and at this point, it's also unclear whether the U.S. and China are even negotiating. The president insists they are, telling Time magazine in a new interview that Chinese President Xi Jinping personally reached out to him. Trump said that after Time asked if he would be willing to make the first call. Will you call President Xi if he doesn't call you? They asked. No, Trump said. You won't? Nope. Time then asking, has he called you yet? Yep, and I don't think that's a sign of weakness on his behalf.
His message was clear. This man does not negotiate fairly. He bullies, he pressures, and he plays dirty. This public slap at Trump wasn't only about the money. It was about Japan standing up for itself against what many in the country see as economic blackmail. But at the same time, Japan's government knows one thing for sure. Without the U.S. alliance, Japan is vulnerable. The American military presence, no matter how controversial, remains a critical piece of Japan's defense plan against China and North South Korea. And while Trump's hardline approach may be pushing Japan's patience, the military reality is forcing them to cooperate. But here's the problem. As Trump bullies Japan for more payments and throws tariffs around like weapons, China is watching, and Beijing is already making moves to take advantage of the cracks Trump is creating between the US and its allies. While Donald Trump is busy pushing Japan harder and harder, demanding more payments, threatening to pull out of security agreements, and imposing higher tariffs on the country's trade, China is quietly working the diplomatic game. The more Trump pressures Japan, the more space China has to squeeze into the cracks of America's old alliances. They are offering trade deals, holding joint meetings, and building closer ties with the very countries the US is supposed to be working with. Former US Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, warned about this during his appearance on The Daily Show in April 2025. He said that Trump's approach is not just bad policy, but it's actually playing straight into Beijing's hands.
It's the most reckless thing done by a president. He's giving China a get-out-of-jail card. They were in the doghouse with everybody.
Emanuel pointed out that America's power in the Pacific region doesn't come from just military strength. It comes from the relationships and trust the US has built with allies like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and the Philippines. When Trump starts treating these allies like enemies, China steps in and offers a friendlier handshake. In fact, right after Trump began ramping up his pressure on Japan, China quickly held two high-profile meetings, one with Japanese leaders and another with officials from South Korea. These meetings were reportedly about diplomatic cooperation, trade agreements, and regional stability. This is something Rahm Emanuel and other experts have warned about over and over again. If America turns its back on its allies, China will be right there to fill the gap. And it's not just Japan. China has also been cutting deals with other key US allies, including Vietnam, Australia, Canada, and some European countries. China even held talks with Vietnam and Australia about energy cooperation while striking trade agreements that used to be America's leverage. In the middle of all this, Trump continues to hammer his old egoistic talking points. When a reporter questioned him about China stepping in and holding meetings with America's allies, his answer was as dismissive as ever. Trump said, quote, "No, no, no, nobody can compete with us. Nobody." But the reality on the ground tells a different story, because while Trump is putting up barriers, China is building bridges. And if Japan, South Korea, and other Pacific nations start believing that China is the more reliable partner, the balance of power in the region could shift dramatically. Now, do you believe Japan has now built its military strong enough to challenge China head-on if it ever comes to war? And do you think the world is truly prepared for what could happen if Japan, China, and the United States all end up on a collision course at the same time? Feel free to share your thoughts with us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth videos like this. Meanwhile, you should click on any of the cards on your screen right now to watch more of our videos.